Are you ready to learn some new French words, expressions, grammar, see how the French use a bit of English in their day-to-day language these days, all through the lens of Lupin épisode 5? Of course you are, that's why you clicked on the thumbnail. Merci beaucoup. So if you're ready, si vous êtes prêts, on va se plonger directement dedans pour l'épisode 5 de Lupin. Allez, c'est parti.
Mais alors je fais quoi? Je me couche? J'abandonne, je laisse gagner? Je m'excuse même si tu veux. Encore désolé du dérangement, monsieur Pellegrini. Pardon, monsieur. Encore?
So the first thing I want to talk about is that word encore here that he used at the end of that sentence. Now, I don't know about you, but when I first arrived in France with around a B1 level intermediate of French, I knew that encore meant yet. But did I know that was just the tip of the iceberg? Encore can mean several things, notably yet, still, but also again. And this is what he means here in this sentence. He's talking about apologizing. Do you want me to apologize encore? Apologize again.
Je m'excuse même si tu veux. Encore désolé du dérangement, monsieur Pellegrini. Pardon, monsieur. Encore?
But it can also mean yet. For example, je n'ai pas encore regardé la dernière vidéo d'Alex. And when you have something that is running out, but you say there's still some left, il reste encore des choses. There's still some left. So it can mean several things. Let me know down in the comments what you think of this word. Is this something that blocks you, or do you find it quite straightforward? How are you approaching the complexity of it? I really can't wait to find out, because it's one that posed me several problems throughout my French learning journey.
Je m'excuse même si tu veux. Encore désolé du dérangement, monsieur Pellegrini. Pardon, monsieur. Encore?
T'as une vie, Hassan. T'as une femme et un fils. Un fils dont c'est l'anniversaire.
Right, for the second week in a row, we get to talk about my good old friend, which is donc, the French word donc. Last week, I told you about two particular meanings of it. Now here we have potentially a third. I think it's different from the other two. And here it can be thought of as meaning whose. Whose, so it's talking about the possession of something or the connection of something to something else. So here he says t'as une femme et un fils, et puis un fils dont c'est l'anniversaire.
Un fils dont c'est l'anniversaire.
So a son whose birthday it is. But instead of saying un fils dont l'anniversaire c'est, it's much more common for them to say un fils dont c'est l'anniversaire. So a son whose birthday it is. So dont here means whose. So dont, a tricky word for us English speakers to get used to, but once you translate it by whose or of whom or of which, it starts to make a bit more sense.
Youssef, franchement c'est dégueulasse que tu sois viré de ta propre affaire.
Non mais c'est rien, t'inquiète. En plus, je kiffe la paperasse, c'est ma passion.
Allez, ciao.
Ciao.
Now, we all know that the subjunctive is a tricky thing to get used to. There are many different rules which determine whether you use it. Now, one of those rules is when you are giving an opinion or expressing an emotion. So if you say something like c'est triste que or c'est bon que, right? It's using words of emotion. It's describing an opinion or a point of view of someone which is subjective, right? His colleague here, Gedira's colleague here, says c'est dégueulasse.
Franchement, c'est dégueulasse que tu sois viré de ta propre affaire.
So he's saying it's disgusting that tu sois viré de ta propre affaire. So he's saying it's disgusting that you were fired from your own case. But instead of saying c'est dégueulasse que tu es viré de ta propre affaire, he says tu sois viré, because sois is the subjunctive present of être. And we use that because it's following something like c'est dégueulasse que. But like I say, you use the subjunctive whenever you say something like c'est, where is an emotion or a point of view. So c'est triste, c'est bon, c'est bien, c'est honteux, c'est dommage que, plus the phrase you want to say conjugated in the subjunctive.
Dégueulasse que tu sois viré de ta propre affaire.
Non, mais c'est rien, t'inquiète. En plus, je kiffe la paperasse, c'est ma passion.
Allez, ciao.
Ciao.
And then Gedira follows it up by saying, y a pas de problème, je kiffe la paperasse. Je kiffe la paperasse. And kiffer is a informal / slang verb for aimer, to like. So kiffer. I definitely don't use this one enough, but I really want to start using it and figuring out where it's best to use aimer and where it's best to use kiffer. And truly, I've heard this one since I arrived in France, but never really let it enter into my vocabulary.
Ouais, gars. Hop là. Voilà.
Hassan, je te rappelle qu'il a 14 ans.
Très bien. Ça te plaît pas?
Bah... Les bouquins de Lupin, je kiffe, hein, mais... Le costume, je suis pas sûr.
Moi, je suis sûr. Tu vas kiffer ça. Fais-moi confiance.
Les bouquins, je kiffe, mais le costume, j'en suis pas sûr. And then his dad says, moi je suis sûr, tu vas kiffer, crois-moi. So straight away, 2 more uses of kiffer. So it's to love, to really like something. Kiffer.
Bon, allez, amusez-vous bien.
Tu viens pas avec nous, toi?
Ah non, je viens pas, non. J'ai déjà un truc.
So it's really common for us English speakers to use the word chose for thing, which is très bien, it works really well. But have you heard of the word truc? I find it's lesser known by English speakers because we don't typically learn it in a class, right? We learn chose. But I would say truc in everyday speech is used far more than chose.
Ah non, je viens pas, non. J'ai déjà un truc.
The French say quelque chose, but they don't use une chose or la chose, right? They use truc. Someone's going to tell me in the comments now that chose is really well used, but I think, and I'm right in saying that truc is more common, especially in situations like this. So she says, j'ai déjà un truc. J'ai déjà un truc is like I have something planned. J'ai déjà un truc. She could have said j'ai déjà un truc prévu to really specify that it's planned, but it's just known from the context.
Je prends ma voix normale. Sérieuse, oui. Bon, on dîne ensemble? 7h, ok, mais par contre, un endroit tranquille à Sam. Pas too much, d'accord? Ok.
For a while, I thought this was something used just between the English-speaking French natives in my group of friends, but I hear it everywhere now. Too much. C'est too much. Pas too much, Hassan. Pas too much is like, well, it's just like how you use it. She wants to eat somewhere a bit quieter, a bit more low-key. Pas too much.
Par contre, un endroit tranquille à Sam. Pas too much, d'accord?
But they use it quite a lot, and for some reason I just find that particularly cute. Frenchies, in the comments, please let me know, why do you think too much has become a thing rather than sticking with the French? And how would you say this if it was in French? Would you just stick with tranquille? Laissez-moi savoir dans les commentaires, s'il vous plaît.
C'est combien, Sam?
85. 84, 85, 86. 86.
Là.
Voilà.
Ah bah, très bien.
I never noticed this before, but now that he says it, it just sounds completely right to me and so natural. But they're looking for their seat numbers, and she asks him, c'est combien, Hassan? C'est combien, Hassan? If you think about it, we use combien because it means how much or how many. But in English, when you're looking for a seat number on a train, you wouldn't say how many, you'd say what seat is it or what number is it, right? Quel numéro? So it's quite normal that we would come to France and say quel numéro when we don't have a reference in French. We learn that as we go, right? That's why it's not so easy just to say stop translating.
C'est combien, Sam?
85. 84, 85, 86.
So I like that. They use c'est combien to talk about the number of the seat on the train. And I'm going to start using that when I next go on public transport where there's a seat number, because it's those little things which make you feel a bit more French and a bit more integrated when you use the exact phrases that the French use, not just literally translating.
J'aime Claire.
Moi, je t'aime toi. Alors, on fait quoi?
This is something that I still haven't mastered in French, and I think I need to speak to more specialists about this. But it makes sense to me. It's just that I feel like when I try and use it, it's not always correct. So he says, j'aime Claire, like I love Claire. And then she says, well, I love you. So you learn when you want to say in French, je t'aime. You have to put the thing that represents toi before the verb, right? Except that when you get into moments where you really want to emphasize something, i.e. the person that you're referring to, it makes more sense to me as an English speaker to put that at the end, because you say, I love you, and then you raise your voice, you increase the stress on that word to say you, and it doesn't really make sense to me. It doesn't feel comfortable to me to put it before the verb, because you've still got something to go after it. Je te aime. It just wouldn't be said like that. So I'm like, what other option is there than to repeat it? However, I don't hear it enough to be sure about it, but slowly but surely I'm seeing it and hearing it more now that I've attuned my eyes and my ears to French. And that's what happens. Once you have an inkling for something, once you have an instinct for something, you start to pick up on stuff in conversations that you didn't before. It's not just because your level has gone up. It's also because you're able to pinpoint areas of the language you want to work on and you want to come to you. So if you rewatch some things that you watched when you were a lower level, I guarantee you'll pick up more subtleties. So here she says, je t'aime toi.
J'aime Claire.
Moi, je t'aime toi.
Je t'aime toi. So she doesn't simply say j'aime toi. She still follows the correct grammatical pattern of je t'aime, and then she adds on toi to give that emphasis. So that's interesting for me. So I'm going to try and keep the pronoun that goes before the verb and then add one afterwards. For example, je te le donne à toi. That's the same logic. Je te le donne, I give it to you, à toi. And I wonder if the Frenchies, again, you agree or disagree with me. Does that work? It follows the same logic. That doesn't always mean that it's going to be accepted. Does it sound weird to you? So yeah, you can use what they call les pronoms toniques, or the stress pronouns at the end of the sentence if you really need to emphasize who it is that is the receiver of this action. In this case, aimer, the love of someone.
C'est le docteur.
Il s'appelle Marc déjà, et en plus, ça te regarde pas.
Et tu l'as revu, Marc, depuis la dernière fois?
Ça ne te regarde pas, je t'en prie.
Elle l'a pas revu.
Hey!
Two uses here of ça ne te regarde pas, ça ne te regarde pas. And I know I keep telling you guys that they drop the ne, but not always, okay? Ça ne te regarde pas, and this is the closest you can get to it doesn't concern you, or it's none of your business. So they use regarder, which means to watch or to look, right? But they use regarder, ça ne te regarde pas.
Ça ne te regarde pas, je t'en prie.
And she gets a bit annoyed because he keeps pressing the subject and she repeats it again. Ça ne te regarde pas. And I probably would have gone with ça ne te concerne pas because it's not something I use very often. In the moment, obviously, your brain goes to what's most obvious. And so this is going to really push a reminder into my brain because I've had to analyze it for this video. So you remember vocabulary a lot easier the more you actually actively focus on a word or phrase within a certain context. So because I'm analyzing it for this video, I've seen it 10 or so times now, and I'm now talking about it. I'm probably never going to forget that again next time.
Il vous a vu?
Non, je crois pas. Mais il est avec sa femme et son gosse.
Vous les laissez tranquilles. Mais lui, vous m'en débarrassez définitivement.
Ça me décevait pas.
I like this word that I try and use often, not in the way that he's using it because he's quite an evil man. This is a verb that I'm trying to use more and more regularly, which I first came across in bars and restaurants. What is a bar or a restaurant? That's going to sound weird after COVID goes away. So, débarasser quelqu'un de quelque chose ou quelqu'un. So because the indirect object is separated from the verb by the preposition de, when the indirect object is a thing and not a person, you replace this with en. So it would be vous m'en débarrassez.
Mais lui, vous m'en débarrassez définitivement.
Ça me décevait pas.
Vous m'en débarrassez. You get rid of this thing from me or for me. So that's quite nice, and I understand the logic of that. And you use this typically in bars and restaurants, and you use the waiter will say je vous débarrasse, while hinting towards the plates on the table, and it means I'll clear this away from you for you. I'll clear your plates. I'll make this tidy for you. You hear that a lot in bars and restaurants. But here he's talking about getting rid of a person, i.e. killing the person, make sure he's not a problem for me anymore. But like I said, you replace the de plus quelque chose with en. You can't replace de plus a person with en. Normally you'd say vous me débarrassez de lui. Vous me débarrassez de lui. So I don't know here whether it's actually a grammatical mistake or it's actually because he's considering the person as a problem. And because the word problem is a thing, it's not a person, you would use en. So, vous me débarrassez du problème would become vous m'en débarrassez. And then he says it définitivement, like forever, which tells us that he means kill him, make sure he can never be a problem for me again.
Mais lui, vous m'en débarrassez définitivement.
Débarrasser quelqu'un de quelque chose ou quelqu'un is a really nice verb. And so I'm trying to use that more and more.
Quoi? Mais t'as pas l'air bien là, ça a l'air sérieux ton truc, donc dis-moi.
Have you ever wondered how to say it seems or you seem in French? Now you look it up and it comes out as sembler. Sembler, right? To seem, literally translated to sembler. The thing is, it's much better to get translations when you have a whole sentence to look up. So then the translator you use has something more to work with and it can apply it to that context. So where sembler can mean to seem, and it can be appropriate, I find the most common thing when you're talking about a vibe someone is giving you is to talk about it with ça a l'air, avoir l'air, followed by the adjective. Or you could say ça a l'air d'être, followed by the adjective. So he says, ça a l'air sérieux ton truc.
Mais t'as pas l'air bien là, ça a l'air sérieux ton truc, donc dis-moi.
Ça a l'air sérieux ton truc. So you could also say ton truc a l'air sérieux, but the French love to repeat themselves. So he says, ça a l'air sérieux ton truc. And this is of avoir l'air, sembler, and paraître, all of which are used in different ways to mean to seem, but I recommend as a learner, you use one when you have a choice between multiple ways of saying something, even though there are nuances between them. If you want to get comfortable and confident speaking, they're just nuances. So just go with one and use it until you're confident with it and then start adding in the others. And I'd recommend you start with avoir l'air because in my experience, it's the most common that I hear in day-to-day speech. But other people could have different opinions based on their conversations, the people they hang out with. So keep an ear open and use the one you feel comfortable with.
Bonjour. Je vois que vous aussi, vous allez être tard.
Vous êtes fan de Lupin?
Un très grand fan. Et toi?
J'adore. C'est mon père qui m'a fait découvrir.
So for those of you who watched last week's video on episode 4 of Lupin, we talked about something called le causatif in French, which is when you put the verb faire before another verb to actually talk about you being the cause of an action rather than you actually doing the action. So we had faire revenir Fabienne Berriot. He was the cause of her being able to bring back her old self, but he didn't actually go and physically bring back the old version of herself. He caused it to happen. Now here, his son, Raoul, says, c'est mon père qui m'a fait découvrir ça, ou Lupin. And it means you can imagine with découvrir, which means to discover, he made me discover, he introduced me to it, he opened my eyes to this world. And they say this quite often, faire découvrir quelque chose is to introduce someone to something.
Et toi? J'adore, c'est mon père qui m'a fait découvrir.
Deeper than présenter, because présenter is literally like just introduce and then off you go. It's faire découvrir, it's sort of like held your hand as you dove, that's quite American, dived into this new hobby or whatever the thing may be. Faire découvrir. One of the other forms I hear quite often is faire visiter. Faire visiter. If you show someone around somewhere, you can faire visiter. So, je te fais visiter mon appartement. I'll give you the tour of my apartment. Je te fais visiter, ou je te fais visiter Montpellier ou Paris. So, faire visiter aussi.
Bon, Raoul, on y va?
Charge.
Now, down in the comments for one of my previous Lupin videos, I had a great comment the other day from Sai, who said he'd heard Claire say to Hassan, à tout, and he replies, à tout. And so he went searching for what this meant with à tout, with an E on the end. But he also brings up how he'd heard tout à l'heure. So I want to talk a little bit about this. So basically, one of the ways you say see you later in French is to say à tout à l'heure. À tout à l'heure. And the à at the beginning is very important to that because tout à l'heure on its own means something else. So à tout à l'heure means see you later. But it's very common in French to shorten it to just say à tout. Now you see from à tout à l'heure, there's no E on the end of tout, right? But when you say it, because tout ends in a T and the next letter is a vowel, you create that liaison, which becomes à tout à l'heure, right? Normally you just say tout when it's this masculine singular form. So therefore, when you shorten it, and then you're writing it, i.e. in the subtitles or in text message, you try to recreate that sound with that liaison. So by putting the E on the end, it ensures that if you say it out loud, it tells people the rule, which is to pronounce the T. And then tout à l'heure, the expression tout à l'heure, without the A at the beginning, means both later on, and earlier on. But don't worry, because if you're talking about the past, you're going to use the past tense. So if they say, je t'ai vu tout à l'heure, je t'ai vu tout à l'heure, you know it means I saw you earlier. And then if you said, je vais te voir tout à l'heure, je vais te voir tout à l'heure, it means I'm going to see you later. So it's a bit weird, but they use tout à l'heure and it can mean both earlier and later. The way we shorten à tout à l'heure, but keep the sound of that last couple of letters in à tout is similar to the other way of saying see you later, which is à plus tard, à plus tard. You can also shorten that to à plus. And you notice here we pronounce the S in à plus, but you don't pronounce the S in à plus tard. And it's simply because you shorten it. But here there's no liaison, so I don't really know why they do that. Why they don't just say à plus. Maybe the French just say it sounds better to their ears. But there you go. So you've got à tout and à plus. And sometimes you see it written à with the plus sign next to it in a text message. À plus. But thank you, Sai, for your comment. This is very useful, and I'm sure a lot of people will have been wondering this as well.
En fait, je me souviens plus. Comment est-ce qu'il finit, Lupin?
Je sais pas. Il s'est jamais fait choper.
Ben, ça prouve que c'est une fiction, parce que dans la vraie vie, Lupin, il se fait choper direct. Hein.
And here we have another use of le causatif. He says, she asks him, how does he end up? How does Lupin end up in his stories? And her son says, il s'est jamais fait choper. Il s'est jamais fait choper. So here he's using the form se faire choper. Se faire choper. Choper means to catch, right? It's sort of like the informal form of like arrested, arrêté. Il s'est jamais fait arrêter would mean the same thing, but il s'est jamais fait choper. And if you remember from last week, we talked about how, yes, you can use faire plus a verb, but you can also use se faire plus a verb if it's reflexive. So he says, il s'est jamais fait choper. He never got himself caught. He never got himself caught. He was never the cause of himself being caught, if you want to translate it. But translation isn't always useful.
Je sais pas. Il s'est jamais fait choper.
And Claire follows up with, bah, ça prouve que c'est une fiction parce que dans la vraie vie, Lupin, il se fait choper direct. Il se fait choper direct.
Ben, ça prouve que c'est une fiction, parce que dans la vraie vie, Lupin, il se fait choper direct. Hein.
Now here you might say, well, she's talking about hypothesis, so you should use conditional, but they use present. The French like to use the present in a lot of ways, and this actually makes me think that it's a way of simplifying the language. But of course, you don't know they use the present until you actually start hearing it. So, Lupin, il se fait choper direct. He gets caught immediately. So direct, I think, is an abbreviation of directement, but either way, you understand it. Voilà, ça c'est tous mes commentaires sur le 5e épisode de Lupin, partie 1. I've absolutely loved covering these 5 episodes and I can't wait. J'ai hâte de voir la sortie des 5 derniers épisodes in the summer. Apparently that is planned for. Thank you so much for being a part of these last 5 videos on Lupin. Honestly, je me suis éclaté. I had a blast. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching. If you want to check out any of the other parts, you can click up here. If you want to watch another video on some other TV shows, click up here. Or if you want to watch a video that YouTube thinks you'll like, click over here. Merci beaucoup d'avoir regardé, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao.